topic. My name is Joe Aliota. I am the 2020 AIA New York State President. Welcome to the next installment of the AIA New York State's live webinar series entitled Insurance Coverage Update in the COVID-19 Age, What Keeps You Up at Night? This session will run for approximately 1.5 hours with time for Q&A at the end. In order to receive your 1.5 learning units, you must be present for the entire session. Throughout the program, you will see 4 words appear in the chat box and on the screen at various times. Please take note of these words as you see them. You'll be required to write them on your CE link that will be provided in the chat at the conclusion of the program. This link must be filled out and returned to us no later than tonight at midnight. Again, please make sure you open your chat box to see these words and the CE link. Questions and participation throughout the session are encouraged, but please keep your microphone muted and your video cameras off. If you have a content question for the presenter, use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties or question about the webinar itself, use the chat and we'll do our best to answer you during the webinar. Please note, the information provided during this webinar does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. Instead, all information, content, and materials available during this webinar are for general informational purposes only. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Our moderator today is Michael K. DiChiara, Esquire, Honorable AIA New York State from Zetlin and DiChiara LLP. Our panelists include Lionel Bejan from Grayland Insurance Brokerage and Risk Consulting, Inc., Dina B. Callow, Esquire from Saul, Ewing, Arstein and Lear LLP, Anthony J. DeBrita Jr., Esquire from Zetlin and DiChiara LLP, Peter Kopish, CIC, CPCU, ARM from William H. Connolly Company, LLC, Mary Beth Rumble from Pool Professionals, and Kevin Vienna from Marshall and Sterling Insurance. With that, Michael, please take it away.
Okay, well, Joe, thank you very much. I just want to reiterate the purpose of today's panel discussion is to bring some information to the general community. It's important that I stress that we are not giving you specific or even general legal advice. What we're saying is to get information out to you, get issues out to you, get you thinking about things. But nobody should rely, that is, take action based solely upon what you hear in this presentation. You really need to, if anybody has real questions and real issues, consult your specific design professionals, your specific legal professionals, accounting professionals, insurance professionals. Those are the people, and by the way, healthcare professionals, because those are the people that really need to be answering your specific questions. Having said that, we're going to jump into this, and I think we're going to start off in the area that's probably most relevant to the community, which is the first question: how do I bring back my employees into our office? And by that, I think what people are saying is, what procedures do I need to follow? And for that first discussion, and it's going to be a roundtable discussion, everybody, but I'd like to kick it off to Dina Callow. Dina is one of the top employment lawyers dealing with all kinds of industries, but she has a specific expertise, if you will, with design and construction, representing owners, architects, engineers, and in my experience, you know, Dina is one of the best there is. So you're getting the benefit of a real all-star. So Dina, in terms of bringing people back, I'm sure you've had clients ask you questions. And again, this is not specific advice anybody should be following without consulting with your own independent lawyers and other professionals. But Dina?
Thank you, Michael. So one of the things that I know everybody is grappling with now is, how do we bring employees back? And first of all, you have to consult with your state's orders, right? That's number one. When is my state allowing our employees to come back to the office? And as we understand it, it's a very slow process, and each state is doing it by phases. New York is going to a phased environment, and they're calling it 1, 2, 3. Other states are calling it red, yellow, green. But first, determine what phase you fall in and look at your state's orders. Interestingly, in the environment that you all fall in, mostly it is an office space. And I'm going to caution you to take this very slowly. On last few days, I've seen a lot of office environments start to put out communications to all of their employees about what they intend to do, right? It's going to be a slow comeback to the office. It's going to be safe, right? And when you think about what safe looks like, as we're starting to counsel clients now, there's a couple of things that we are thinking about. One is, what is our preparedness plan if we have an issue or an outbreak at the office? You have to have that ready before anybody comes back. And then how are we going to phase in our employees? And one of the things that we need to be thinking about is who should be coming back first, right? It may be that you have groups or teams that are not working well from a performance perspective or from a project perspective remotely. And so those may be the employees you want to see come back first. But even those employees, you have to be thinking through issues of, do they have health issues that we should be thinking about? Do they have childcare issues that we need to be thinking about? And when they walk in that door, are we going to be doing, or are we required to be doing temperature checks? Are we required to be masking, which almost every state is requiring masks for interactions? Are gloves required? Are hand sanitizing stations required? Are we ensuring that we're doing cleaning and ventilating at our site? So those are certainly the things that we should be thinking about and putting out to our employees before they ever walk in the door. The other thing is, nobody has really, when we had meetings before, everybody was wrapped around a table. We have to think about social distancing, both in cubicle spaces, in office spaces, and in conference room spaces. So is our office set up for social distancing? And if it's not, let's get it ready before our employees first walk in the door. So planning is going to be important. Checklists are going to be important. And certainly, if there is an outbreak or if somebody gets sick in the office, what is our emergency? And is that emergency plan ready for that employee's first day of work?
All right. Dina, there's been a lot of talk about staggering the workforce. Is that suggested? Is that something that you hear people discussing generally?
So absolutely, not only staggering your entire workforce, but even shifts and teams, and maybe, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Michael,
we can
hear
hear
me? Okay, great.
Yes, yes, I can hear you now.
So staggering shifts, staggering teams. Okay, perfect. So we want to make sure that we are staggering, because think about it, depending on the office space that you're in New York City in particular, if we bring everybody back and have a start time of 8 a.m., we're going to have problems with social distancing, not only with our workforce, but with other individuals' workforces, right? So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're staggering our start times and probably even days of the week that we require our teams to come in. And that's why the planning before our first day of work really becomes important.
So one of the participants had sent in a question that basically says, are there protocols for sanitizing offices? How often should offices be sanitized? Are there cleaning protocols? And this is really for New York State, if we're aware of them. And if we don't know particularly what they are, I wouldn't expect we would, Dina. But where do people look for that kind of stuff?
Is this a question for me?
Yeah, it's a question for anybody. Anybody else on the panel want to chime in, or?
I mean, I certainly can tackle it. On New York's website, again, I'm assuming these are all New York specific, but on New York's COVID website, there are some great resources for what you should be looking for and what's required. In addition, I think it is important to look at the CDC's website, OSHA's website, and if there are industry specific questions, which here we have office spaces, look to those. I know there are some questions coming up on the chat box, you know, about contractors and site specific, and I think we're going to talk about those specifically as well, because there are right now, because contractors and construction are going to be in phase 1 of reopening, there are some really specific requirements about sanitizing and cleaning when we start reopening phase 1 and contractor sites. So I don't know if somebody else wants to talk a little bit about that, but there are going to be very specific requirements. I think the best thing to do in this order, in my opinion, is look at your state's order and your state's website, go to the CDC and go to OSHA, and make sure you're following all the guidelines set out by those three.
Michael,
Right.
if I could chime in, another area,
Yeah.
another source could be the firm's health insurance carrier, as well as their workers' compensation carrier. These are two entities that don't want claims, obviously, and they should be able to give you some good guidelines on how to do the sanitation of your offices and visiting job sites and so forth and so on. So those are two possible other sources of information you can find.
Right, so Peter, the first one was the firm's health insurance carrier, and the second
Yes.
was what?
The workers' compensation insurance carrier.
So following up on what Dina said, and I guess, Peter, what you touched on. So we start to bring employees back. We follow whatever available protocols are out there. But we know, and in fact we know because apparently it's already started, the plaintiff's bar is going to have a field day. So somebody comes back, I'm a 10-person architectural firm or a 1,000-person firm, doesn't make a difference. And I have followed all the appropriate protocols. I followed the New York protocol, CDC's protocol, anything that was industry specific, anything that OSHA may have put out there. I spoke with my carriers, but I get sued anyway. So to the brokers, this is to Bijan, Peter, Kevin, will their insurance protect the architects, and what insurances should they be looking to for protection?
I'll start off by saying if an employee is deemed to catch this disease arising out of his or her work, it may be deemed compensable by the workers' compensation who are insuring that firm. If the firm is
the keyword, the key word is may, and it's going to be dependent upon each carrier and each policy, right, Peter? You're not saying it will be, it may be.
It may be.
Okay.
If the employer was not following guidelines and not keeping a safe workplace, the carrier will cover, and it becomes a little bit of a different issue, but the workers' comp policy will at least defend the firm initially.
Okay. I guess I would ask Bijan and Kevin, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think Peter, this is Lionel. Peter is right that I would start with yeah, this is Lionel. I would say Peter is right. I would start with the workers' compensation carrier and see where that goes. Again, all documentation is important. So any firm should keep track of the protocols they went by. I would print them. I would keep a record of what they're going by, when they're doing something, how they're doing it, just in case something happens later. It will not prevent a lawsuit or a claim, but at least it will help people like Dina and Michael defend you if there is a claim made or I agree with Peter.
Right.
And
so,
like Peter
actually,
said, the
kind of timely.
situation is whether or not it will be compensated. No, the challenge is going to be
I'm sorry,
determining
did
the employee, get the virus at the. No, you were saying,
Right.
Peter was saying that it may be compensatable.
So
with that, the determination will be, was the virus caught at work, or did the person bring it from home or pick it up on the way to work? That's going to be the biggest challenge, and that's the challenge in the area of the workers' comp, is that, where did this person get sick?
So that goes to causation, which goes to liability. But I guess the first question is, when somebody brings a claim, it can be very expensive to defend against the claim. And will the insurances, whether it's workers' comp or something else, general liability, will that insurance at least pay for the defense?
The workers' comp, first it's going to result in just a general claim, as far as for whatever medical bills, lost time. If it does develop into more of a liability claim, the workers' comp, if it's the employee, is going to be the sole remedy. So, the situation may be something where you have a subcontractor's employee suing the general contractor. In that case, the general contractor, and basically this applies to everybody, you need to discuss your policy with your broker to find out what restrictions there are, what limitations there are that could preclude coverage, or at least get you the defense while the determination is going on.
All right, so sort of recapping, at least in the phase when people start to come back to work. Dina sort of outlined various sources people can look to. We're telling everybody you need to consult with your professionals to develop your own specific plan. You want that plan to be compliant with everything it needs to be compliant with. And assuming that plan is in place, people still might get sick. I think Kevin raised the issue. You're going to have, whoever the plaintiff is likely going to have some kind of an issue vis-a-vis causation, unless of course half the office gets sick. And then it sounds like what I'm hearing from the brokers is that they believe that there will be some defense available through either the workers' comp doesn't pay for defense, right? It actually pays, it pays people's salaries. It compensates them for being out of work. What insurance would pay for the defense?
So the employer's liability, okay, again, depending on the situation, can provide defense under the employer's liability section of the workers' comp policy.
All right, but again, it's going to be very important for people to understand that they have to, they really have to get up with their brokers, and they have to understand what insurances they have in place. And really the important questions are, if people come back and people have claims that because they came back to work, they got sick, and they sue this firm or me, you know, do I have insurances in place that will A, cover my defense, and B, cover my liability should I be determined to have liability? That's critical. That sort of leads to the next question that came in from one of the participants, which is the concept of waivers. Should the architectural firms or engineering firms, should they try to get their employees to sign a waiver of liability before they come back to the office, which raises the question really for Dina or anybody else, but I think this is sort of in Dina's wheelhouse. How effective would a waiver of liability be in the circumstance?
So in the employment context, a waiver is not going to work, right? We can't have employees waiving liability for issues in the workplace like this. And if an employee refused to sign that, it wouldn't be enforceable. And if an employee refused to sign it, we couldn't fire them because they refused to sign it. So for employees in particular, we couldn't do it. And it wouldn't be enforceable if we did. But, we've been talking a lot amongst our firm partners about waivers in other contexts. For example, vendors, visitors, 1099 contractors, things of that nature, and potentially, you know, trying to negotiate with our unions about some of these issues. I think there are ways to do that. But just saying, hey, employee, you know, you've been out on furlough or you've been out of work, working at home, we now want you to come back. But in order to walk back in, you have to sign this waiver that says if you get COVID, you know, you're not going to sue us. That's it's not enforceable.
So the architects might be able to have waivers with their consultants. Might, again, I say might, and they need to consult with their counsel and see if in fact, or a competent counsel, to see if in fact that's something that might be effective, right?
Michael,
yeah.
For a moment, for those who are looking to get CE credit, the word that you need to write down is portfolio. It's on the screen, PORTFOLIO. Portfolio. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Great word. Yeah, all right. So the next question is, can a firm force an employee to come back to work? I guess, Dina, this is you again.
So can we force an employee to come back to work? So I'm not sure of the context of that. I suppose it's employee is saying, I'm afraid or I'm fearful, and the firm is saying, look, we have a job available for you, so come back and take it. I mean, I'm assuming that's the context. And the answer is, go ahead.
No, it's a, you know, it's a substantial architectural firm. They've got projects they have to get out. They choose, rather than have people work remotely, they really want a team, you know, working on this project. and they go to employee X and they say, look, you got to come in, you got to work, we got to get this done?
So, there's a lot of caveats to this, right? So I'm going to, in my answer, right, I'm going to assume that the employee is not in a high-risk population, does not have any underlying medical conditions or other reasons why the employee cannot come into the office, because then other laws are going to apply, right? We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the EEOC put out some guidance on this just the other day. And there's some other analyses that have to be done. But assuming for the sake of my answer that we have a healthy individual who really is just fearful and is not taking care of kids who are out of school, right? So we have a lot of caveats. But assuming for the sake of this discussion that it's a single individual not taking care of kids whose school's closed, not otherwise high risk, you want them to come to the office because for performance reasons, project reasons, you believe you need them in the office and they refuse to do so. Can you say, if you do not come into the office, you're going to lose your job? The answer is yes, with all my caveats. And before you terminate employment in that regard, I would say definitely get legal advice and talk about the specifics of your facts. I can't describe in the last 6 weeks how many different factual scenarios we've gone through on these very particular issues, especially kind of your staff employees who potentially maybe on furlough or often getting unemployment and don't want to come to work now back to the office, right? Because they're getting more, so to speak, on unemployment than maybe they were getting, or enough that they're comfortable getting unemployment and you want them back to work. Or if you're getting PPP loans and the interaction between PPP and getting your employees back to work, there's a lot of interaction and things that you have to do to document those steps that you've taken and the reason that the employee is not returning and what you've told them and what they've told you. So there's a lot of caveats around that, but if we strip all of those away and you can demonstrate the business needs for the individual to come to the office and that their work cannot be done from a teleworking environment or cannot be done effectively from a teleworking environment, then the answer would be yes.
All right, so let me change the fact pattern just a little bit, Dina. So now it's a person who lives with another person. The other person had tested positive for COVID-19. And it's within 2 weeks of the person's test. How does that affect your answer?
So from a safety and preparedness protocol, what we should be doing is requiring anyone who has been exposed to COVID-19 to quarantine themselves for 14 days with doctor's notes, right? So that's that high risk environment. We don't want individuals coming in to the office who potentially could expose the others in the office. Now, interestingly, when I was looking at this morning, those New York guidelines that I was talking about, one of the things that it says on there is, if we have a potential if one of your employees has been potentially exposed, but is not showing any symptoms, can they return to work? And the answer is yes, with precautions. And those precautions and the things that they're recommending for the contractors and construction industry is on a daily basis, taking temperatures and doing these checklists. Are you having symptoms? What do you have a temperature? And then recording that on a daily basis. I think you could go that route. A better practice may in fact be just telling the individual for 14 days to quarantine at home. So could you as an employer say you must come to work even if your spouse or the person you're living with at home has been exposed to COVID-19 within 14 days? You could, but then I would be concerned about a liability perspective if in fact that person comes in and then lo and behold, they come down with COVID and others in the workplace come down with COVID, similar to what some of the other panelists were talking about. Have you then not followed the guidelines that are out from the CDC, and are you then exposing yourself to liability?
Right, so part of the problem is insurance carriers, many of them, I'm not going to say all of them, but in my experience, many of them look for reasons not to extend coverage. whether it's for defense or whether it's for liability. So if it turns out that there are things that you've done that are inconsistent with published guidelines, how will that affect both defense and liability coverage? And this is, I guess, to Lionel, Peter, and Kevin.
This is Lionel. I think again, it really depends on the allegations that that are out there. It depends what policy is going to respond and how the broker is working with their client to present it to the insurance company. I think, and I don't want to also have a bunch of caveats, but it really depends on the situation and how the response will be, because some of the allegations may kick it out from the get-go. I think if you look at some of the policies, is there, if it's directly related to COVID-19, is there, for example, a specific virus exclusion that may just kick it out? So it's not obvious that there will be defense based on the allegations. I think they'll be very, and Michael, you can correct me, but there'll be very crafty attorneys out there who will know exactly how to phrase the allegations.
Well, if they're smart plaintiffs lawyers, then they're gonna want to get to the insurance because that's where the money is, typically, right? So they'll frame the allegations so that they can maximize their recovery, because it doesn't do them much good if they're suing a firm and they don't have insurance to back it up, right?
I agree with you on that.
Right. Kevin, Peter, you guys have a view on that?
Let me jump in. I agree with Lionel, and keep in mind, you have two things at work here. You have workers' compensation and employer's liability, which is one policy. If you're found negligent, then the employee will sue you, the firm, and possibly collect under the employer's liability section of the policy, which is currently in the state of New York unlimited. If a third party, a vendor, a client of the firm sues from a COVID-related incident, and the firm is found negligent, then you'll not only get defense, but you'll probably get, the third party will probably get a payout of some kind. So the general liability is a negligence-based policy. So that's how it would probably pan out.
Okay.
This is for Dina and Michael. I don't know. Dina, have you seen anything where they bring in their D&O policy?
So it's too early, right? Not yet, but I expect that when these claims start to hit, every policy is going to come in, right? I just think that if the claim is going to be against everyone, including directors and officers, for not instituting the policies or disregarding safety issues, and then all the insurance policies are going to get hit. That's what I suspect is going to happen.
I imagine that applies to the EPLI as well. If there's a claim that they belong in a protected class or something like that.
We've already, so those we have started to see, and anything that's brought by an employee is going to hit employment practices. So I don't know what your guys' experience is, but any class actions that are brought are not going to cover the liability piece, but will likely cover attorney's fees. And I think most are written that way, but I don't know about all. I'll leave that to you guys. But I think anything that hits, it'll be interesting to see what the EPLI carriers are doing with this. But I think anything that alleges retaliation for raising COVID, discrimination, because a lot of the laws, New York has done this already, right? Has added new protected categories that are COVID related. So they're just going to fall under the discrimination and retaliation provisions that are already existing under state law.
The other challenge, like you said, what the carriers are going to be doing is right now, if you go to get coverage, it's very hard to find it if you don't have it already. The carriers are just waiting for all the dust to settle before they start writing new policies.
All right, so I guess another scenario because these are design firms, is, you know, people are working from home. I don't think that's optimal, but it seems to be something that a lot of firms are able to tolerate. A lot of firms have on-site responsibilities. They have to periodically visit sites. They have to look at things. Sometimes they have to go look at materials. Sometimes they have to get on a plane and go to, you know, someplace far away to look at stone or look at some other material that's going to be put on a project. So if part of somebody's job is to take that trip or to visit that site, and they say, look, I really don't feel comfortable in a COVID environment doing this. So, you know, sorry, get somebody else. What action can the firm take under those circumstances? Again, generally. And you know, so everybody understands this is general advice. Check with your specific, you know, lawyer, accountant, insurance broker for your specific facts. But generally, Dina, what do we think? What do we think the firm is able to do in that situation, if anything?
So, I mean, look, first, I would be concerned right now with, right today, telling anybody they had to travel anywhere, right? So I think we have to think through where we are in this state of a pandemic. Are we still in a state of an emergency? What is our state saying? Where is the individual going and how are they getting there? Can they drive? Are they, right? So if I'm going to take a step back, right, a lot of the laws, both federal and state, require an interactive dialogue with the individual when they raise issues that they're scared or nervous, and usually that's because of a medical condition. Okay, and you know, what I'm saying hasn't been tested by any law yet, but I'm just taking a practical approach to it. So somebody comes to you and says, you know, you want them to go to, you know, let's say Chicago, and meet with one of your clients. If you have a project that's kind of stalled, you want them to talk to the client. Okay. Is there a reason? Number one, I think we have to start thinking creatively, right? And I've been talking to a lot of my real estate clients about this, and you know, the way we used to do things before is changing, and some things may not be able to change. I mean, you know, I'm talking to a client on Monday in the insurance space, actually, about their sales, right? And when can we start allowing our sales reps to start meeting with our prospects at restaurants and golf courses? That's just one of the issues. Okay, well, you know, we can, but there's a lot of risk associated with that. And so are there other ways? So one of the things I think we need to start thinking about is, are there other ways to have these meetings where everybody's comfortable and we can get questions answered? So first of all, are there other ways to do that, right? And if there aren't, because we need to meet in person for a variety of reasons, you know, number one, does the individual have a medical condition, right? Is the individual have a mental health condition that is somehow impairing their ability to get over this fear? And that's really important. And then are there other contractual, compliance, regulatory, or other issues that we're managing and that our employee needs to be on site to deal with? Because, you know, those are things we can't overcome on a telephone potentially, or on a Zoom call, right? Zoom's been really an important part of a lot of people's business. And so are there ways to overcome that creatively? And are we thinking creatively enough? Because, by the way, if the employee ever sues because you let them go, discipline them, change their status, or harm their career in some way because they didn't do this, we're going to have to come to the table and defend it by saying, we did everything we could, but we really needed this person to travel for these reasons, right? And if they couldn't travel by plane, they could drive there. We would allow that, right? And if they didn't want to meet across the table, you know, we would permit them to meet with their mask on in a safe environment that we created. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we could get to the same result, assuming that result is required. but we need to follow the steps and be creative to ensure that it is required so that if we ever get to a liability perspective and we're evaluating risk, that we're going to be on the right side of that analysis.
Dina, I just want to add to that kind of, on the other side of, or thinking of other ways to do things. So we're hearing now from some firms regarding virtual site visits. So what does that mean? So maybe you're required, or maybe there's discussion about that it's, we're at an important step in the construction phase, which is still continuing on in New York, and we need to perform a site visit. Our folks are not, are nervous about that or whatever. So we have talked to some firms who are interested in virtual site visits. So what does that mean? So now you have to have someone who's already at the site, show the video, walk around with the Zoom meeting on or whatever it is, and say, I need to see, in order to approve this pay application, I need to see A, B, C, and D. And so that might sound easy enough, but there's also risk with that, right? So now you have to be able to rely on that information. Of course, we need buy-in from the team. So it comes back to some of your basic loss prevention protocols around communication and documentation. So you want to continue to employ all those good practices as you think of new ways to complete things, to still be safe, but to still be able to move forward with a project. So all the things Dina talked about in the beginning about, employees and claims and things like that, we still need to obviously comprehend that. But as we're coming up with different ways to perform some of these services, just be sure that you're kind of accounting for all four corners, or whatever the right term is. Check with the owner, work with the contractor, document who's doing what, who's responsible for what, how we're going to proceed, how it affects the schedule. So and managing your risk just like you did before COVID.
In terms of having employees work remotely, Mary Beth, have you found, is the profession finding that that's creating problems in terms of communication or quality of work, or any other kind of problems?
Yeah, sometimes we do hear about that. I know just today our agency is having problems connecting to our system, so it does happen. But in general, so many times firms have very deliberate processes to establish a work from home employee, right? And there's approvals, and then they're setting them up or whatever. So now there was this mass exodus to go home, and maybe you didn't get a chance to go through those proper approvals, proper security measures and things like that. So now is a good time to kind of go back and revisit those standard protocols or create new ones and relook at what's going on. Who's working from home? You have assets out there. Maybe it's, do your asset inventory, figure out where your computers are, and establish the proper security protocols for those folks that are now working from home. And you'll want to, again, talking about insurance, check with your general liability and property insurance brokers, because remember, you had stuff in your office building and now it's all over the place. So is it covered? What if it breaks? What if it gets stolen? So you want to make sure you understand what kind of coverage is in place for that. So if you, like Dina or somebody mentioned, we have to think about where we are right now. We're still at home. Nothing's going to happen very quickly. So while your folks are at home, maybe take a look at those things. And we've also heard from smaller firms who are saying, well, geez, this is working out pretty good. Maybe we don't go back to the office. I think we've all probably seen already in articles talking about how rental space is going to go empty because people are, are okay with working from home. So, anyways, just some things to consider. But I would say the biggest would be, get your asset inventory in order, understand what your coverage is, and get your security, make sure you double check your security on those home systems.
And
Right, so
Michael, if
I just want to jump in with the word is exposure, that red word you all have to write down. Sorry, Peter.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm just adding on to Mary Beth. We're recommending to our clients to have their employees not use their personal computers for work, if at all possible. They're not set up properly. They don't have the proper firewalls, and that could be a very big problem if something sneaks in the back door and affects our clients' IT. So that's an important procedure at this point when a lot of folks are home and working.
So
I would say, like to what Peter and Mary Beth were saying, is check with your broker to talk to the property carrier, and also importantly to your cyber liability carrier to see how they can help you. What protocols should be in place? Do you have coverage? What kind of coverage? Do you need to modify your coverage? I would really look into that now.
yeah, Leonel, what type of policy would typically cover cyber liability?
Well, some of the architects' professional liability coverage adds some type of cyber liability. I like a separate standalone cyber liability. Right now, the market is such that you can get very comprehensive and broad coverage for pretty good prices these days. So I would get a separate cyber liability that would protect the firm a lot better. That's my thought.
I would agree with that. The challenge when you are buying policy, like Lionel said, the professional that gives some incidental cyber or incidental employment practices, is that it's a throw-in, so it's not going to be as strong a coverage as you would like. And when it comes to the cyber, unfortunately, the forensic costs that go into cleaning out a system and making sure that it's virus-free can get very costly. People say that, well, I've got it backed up. Well, the problem is years ago when people would get a virus on their system, they pretty much know about it within 15 minutes to 24 hours. Nowadays, we're finding that the viruses can be sitting in the background anywhere from 6 months to a year, monitoring all the activity, keystroke activity. So they're able to see passwords, usernames, all types of information. And when someone finds the virus on their system, I've had clients that, no problem, we switched over to the backup, and unfortunately the backup still continued to have the virus as part of the system. So you really need a full-strength cyber policy.
Is that a casualty or a liability policy or both? And what if those problems cause damage to your client?
Right. It's the liability, and it's basically what we call first party and third party. So the first party were the incidental coverages that they actually used to throw in just to give some incidental coverages. But now it's covering, in many cases, paying out more than the liability policy because it's covering the damages to the systems, to your own systems. To third party, again, it's liability. Again, look at the policies. In many cases, it's you might buy a policy that's liability for privacy issues only, but there could be coverage also for damaged data, damaged systems that are covered by the cyber policy.
So I guess one of the questions, and Mary Beth, you raised it, is, assuming you have coverages, but now you have a bunch of employees working from home. It sort of happened virtually overnight. And okay, now people are using, in many instances, their personal computers. They didn't really have a choice. How does that affect this coverage? And I guess, Mary Beth, are you finding that that's more the case? People are using their personal stuff?
I guess I guess I don't have a good feel for that. I feel like most are using their workstations. Like I've heard a lot of folks just going in and picking up the whole darn thing and taking it home.
Wow.
I imagine there are using personal computers, but I feel like at least some of the firms I've been talking to is they're requiring the use of the systems that are already have all the right stuff, you know, all the malware and all the right software in there. I'm sure some are using their home computers, but I feel like I hear more that people just took their stuff home.
Yeah.
Anybody
All right.
else? Did you guys hear other?
I think it's a mixed bag, you know, I mean, and obviously it only takes one person using their personal computer to create havoc. Michael, I think your question, if I can answer it,
Sure.
the firms need to go to their broker and their insurance policy and the insurance carrier to make sure they know that you might have employees using their own equipment and make sure there's no exclusions under their cyber policy.
Right.
Or that type of thing. And like a lot of this stuff, it's communication. Communicate up and down the line on all these issues. So that's a question that the firms can ask their broker and look at their insurance policy and make sure the carrier's aware of what's going on. And they probably are, but just double check.
Wow. So let me ask you this. So you have a bunch of firms out there that are listening to the conversation. Some may have the special cyber insurance. Some may not. They have to check with their broker. Some may have it covered under the general liability. Some may not. What advice would you give to people today so that they can at least ask their brokers and the carriers questions so they can figure out where they are?
Basically, I would tell them that they need to look at a policy that covers first party, okay, provides first party coverage as well as third party coverage. The challenge with the typical insurance policy, say general liability, property, auto, is that from an industry-wide standpoint, probably 70 to 80% of the policies contain similar wording. And it's those final little tweaks that the carriers do to set themselves aside from the competition. When it comes to the cyber world, it's a new product that's only been around for a few years. So I refer to it as being in the Wild West. Everyone's doing their own thing. And, you know, as they learn of a competitor coming out with a new coverage, you know, one of the things I had never heard of before is bricking. There's a new virus that basically, it's a, you know, techie term that it turns your phone, your computer into a brick. It's totally useless. The only thing it can be used for is a paperweight. And some carriers, you know, now provide full coverage that if your system gets bricked, they'll buy you a brand new system. So it's truly the Wild West. And so don't, you know, get caught on just looking at price. You need to have your broker do a full analysis of the coverages side by side.
Yeah, that's a great point. Talk to your broker also about what your needs are. You know, are you hosting websites for projects or not? How much data do you collect that belongs to your clients? Where do you store it? How do you store it? What are your encryption policies? There are tons of things that your broker will know about and will be able to get to the right carriers to get the right coverage for your particular firm. But it's definitely not a one coverage covers it all. You really need to see what you're doing and what you need.
All right, so let's sort of switch gears now. And before we get into the next topic, which is contract protections. So there are a bunch of ongoing projects. Hopefully, you know, most of the people listening, their practice, you know, I'm sure everyone's practice has been affected, but hopefully they still have most of their practice left. So now they're working. And I guess the question is, given this new reality we're in, you know it's going to affect design services, right? So before we get into the obvious question, which is the impacts that this disease will have on delays, I'm sort of concerned about the challenges when the owner comes to the architect and says, okay, now I need you, we're in the middle of designing, whatever it is, an office renovation. But my office has to be set up differently. I need you to give me a design that will protect me and my employees against COVID and other pandemics that may follow. I mean, okay, and then the architects, if they're smart, they're gonna tell the owner, well, you gotta bring in some medical people to tell us what the parameters are. Is it 6 feet? Is it 7 feet? Is it 3 feet? We need to know from the perspective of, the mechanical engineers, do we need negative space, positive space, how much air change, what kind of filters do we need to implement, from industrial hygienists, what types of devices do we have to have in terms of, hand cleaning capability and in terms of masks and everything else. But what, under that circumstance, and sort of new exposures that might be created as a result of that, how do you anticipate the insurance industry responding? Is it going to be business as usual? They'll be covered by the E&O policy if they don't design it right? Are carriers going to be looking to exclude certain things? Do they currently exclude certain things? Somebody, anybody?
Yeah, this is Pete. I think they're going to look to exclude anything to do with viruses. I think they do now, and I think they will in the future from a professional liability standpoint. It's not the purpose of this policy to take on that risk. It's not priced for that. It's not what they do. And I think what the architects have to continue to do is not to warrant or not to guarantee their work. But that's what I think what's going to happen as far as the professional liability space is going to be.
Right, so that's a segue into contracts. So Tony, I'm going to turn to you for this one. So now we're in a different world. We're negotiating a contract for an architect, typical, just call it a typical office building. It could be a 3-story, 2-story, 4-person office in Poughkeepsie. It could be a skyscraper in Manhattan. We need to put in language. Architects need to demand that their lawyers create language that will protect them so that they're not the guarantors of a safe environment. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tony?
Certainly. I think that we have to, we have to be honest with ourselves about, and we as lawyers do this as well, what is our area of expertise and how can we help the client? We also need to put boundaries on that and recognize that if this is anybody's area of expertise right now, it's not ours. And as we would approach other issues such as ADA compliance, brownfield, LEED certification, they're all very complicated scenarios where the outcome is dependent on many factors that architects are simply not within the control of the architect. So we need to exercise the same good risk management practices that we have all along. We need to communicate well with our clients and explain to them what you can do and what you can't do. And when it comes to exposures to pathogens, recommendation, first you need a very clear scope explaining what you do and what you can't do. And then responsibility for exposure to pathogens or designing to mitigate exposure to pathogens should be clearly excluded from your responsibility, like hazmat exposures might be excluded, like construction means and methods and site safety might be. Then, as with those kinds of things, and geotechnical and soil consultants, you want to get the owner to agree to hire those specialty consultants, so that you're not on the hook for determining what the design should look like. You want to be able to rely on the recommendations that provide to you, and your responsibility is then to take those design criteria and make sure your design responds to them. So you want to make sure that the owner retains the appropriate specialty consultants, and you may need to help the owner figure out who they might be, but that's where your responsibility should stop until you have criteria that you can respond to in the design of the architectural design of the project. The same holds for the mechanical engineer as well. They're going to need to be able to rely on very similar kinds of information because they're aspects of the building. Now,
All right, so,
sorry, go ahead, Michael.
no, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So once you have that, once you have the owner retaining them, the next contractual hurdle, if you will, is to get a clear right to rely on them in your contract, so that if there is a claim brought, you can point to very clear language saying, I didn't have oversight over them, I didn't have control of them. I have the right to rely on the fact that whatever information they give me, documentation they give me, services that they perform are sufficient, adequate, and accurate for me to then go rely on that. I don't have to check that information. I rely on that information, respond to it in my drawings. And that's my exposure is, did I respond to that criteria? Not, was that criteria correct or not?
All right, so, which I guess leads to the next set of questions, which is to the insurance panel. Okay, so now we've gone through this horrific experience. We're designing a school. The design simply had to stop for a period of time. The project had to stop because for a period of time there was no construction activity. The school misses a school year. They incur a lot of expenses. They sue the design team and the construction team saying, hey, you had a contract. You were supposed to, have this thing done on a specific date. Unfortunately, everybody signed horrible contracts that had times of the essence. Is this going to be covered by insurance?
And the answer is maybe. It's all going to point back to the contract. What exactly does it say? Is there liquidated damages? Is there any force majeure clauses? It's going to point back to the contract, and that's going to once the claim is sent into the insurance carrier, they're going to want to copy the signed and executed contract, and that's going to dictate what's covered, what they're going to pay, or if they're going to fight it.
All right. So if the contract doesn't mention pandemics, and if the contractor, architect, engineer were lucky enough to have an insurance contract that didn't have an exclusion for a pandemic, is it safe to assume that they at least have a strong argument that they have coverage?
I think they're going to have coverage from it. The carrier may pay out on that. It depends.
I'm sure, Michael, that in the few years you've been defending architects, I'm sure you've had quite a few delay claims that you've defended. I don't think a delay claim is anything new. I think the focus right now should be for all the architects and all their consultants is how they're communicating with their clients when there are delays. Are they just taking everybody knows about COVID-19 and delays, or are they being proactive and reaching out to their clients, and they say, hey, by the way, construction is going to stop for 6 months. That will delay the project, and then start a dialogue, and hopefully those good bedside manners will pay off in the end instead of having nasty claims. But most of the professional liability policies out there, you know, don't have a pandemic exclusions that I know of. I don't think on the PL side it's come yet. I can't speak for the insurers and see what they're going to do after this. But I would say right now it comes on, and Mary Beth mentioned it a while back, about it's still coming back to the basics of risk management. And I would say right now it's all about communicating with the client and talking about delays and what can be done, and working together. I think that's really the focus of it.
All right, so Mary Beth, do you think it's as simple as, and I know it's not, I'm saying simple, but we all know it's not so simple, but reaching out in some way to the client and starting to have a conversation about we're all in this together? And how do you do that? I mean, how do you do that effectively? Mary Beth, have we lost you?
Did I, am I here? Did you get me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, I totally feel that's very important, and it should have already been going on, is good communicate. You know, what keeps you out of trouble is there are lots of errors and omissions. There's all kinds of issues on a project, but you don't always get sued, right? And that's because you have good communication, good documentation, talking through the issues, and that's exactly what needs to happen now, or even really before now. And we know that if a claim comes, it's not going to come next week or next month. It's going to be 6 months, 12 months from now. So even more reason to document the conversation that you have with the owner about what's the scenario. We know the schedule is such and such, but we're unable to get to the site at this amount of time, or the contractor we know is a little bit behind. You know, we kind of have to pull everyone together, but make sure those conversations are documented, and follow up through email or whatever, so that everybody's on the same page. Again, there's going to be mistakes, there are going to be delays, and I know we don't, architects, engineers, you know, we're not always the ones that want to deliver the bad news, but you're always better off being upfront and explaining, you know, what the impact could be based on either your inability to get to the job site, or things that are happening with materials not being delivered, or contractors not being able to finish. So, you know, we're all about risk management, checklists, documentation, and that's what we use, you know, Michael and Dina and Tony, to defend you if something does go wrong. So just continue, you know, doing a good job with those sort of practices, and make sure your team is doing that, because we know it's hard to all be on the same page, because everybody's all over the place now. But that's a good team reminder, is to continue those good practices.
In fact, I would use this as an opportunity to get closer with your clients. I mean, this is a great opportunity for the architects to call up the clients and say, hey, we know this is horrible. You know, we've all been affected. We're here to help you as best we can, you know, as we try to get through this. But, you know, I would view this as an opportunity to get closer to your client. And to follow up on what Mary Beth is saying, you know, I think first of clients will appreciate knowing that you're being proactive and that you're sort of there for them. And it might help mitigate any issues that happen later, because Mary Beth, I agree. No project, no undertaking that a human does is perfect. It ain't gonna be. And there can be little problems, there can be big problems. But I have to tell you, I've seen some very large problems that I thought would result in major lawsuits that ended up not being litigated, because people talked and they had good relationships and they got past it. And I've seen relatively small issues turn into huge, firestorms because people just ignored it, or they buried it, or they didn't pay attention to it. The other thing that concerns me, and I hopefully, workers' compensation, I guess, is just come up on my screen. But one of the things that really concerns me for the profession is coordination. And coordination is always an issue to begin with, but I think it's a particular issue now. So you've got people working remotely, and one of the nice things about an office is it's easier to sort of get people together to go over things, to be reminded that maybe you have to call your consultants. Coordination, not just of your practice, but with your consultants, is something you really need to keep an eye on, because most of the really nasty lawsuits I've defended over the last 30 years have involved the lack of coordination when it involves the architect. We'd be remiss if we didn't touch on pro bono work. So let me ask the insurance panel, to the extent that architectural firms are involved in pro bono work as a result of this, this pandemic, or in general. Oh, the word, by the way, is liability, the CE word. To the extent firms are involved in pro bono work, how does that impact their insurance coverages and their potential liability?
Well, one of the things, like we've said a few times, is check your policy, check with your broker. There are policies which define professional services as a service that's done in exchange for a fee. And then there are other policies that just say, services that are performed under contract, or just general services for which you are licensed. So any one of those could either negate coverage or provide coverage. So it's something that you need to check with your broker, check your policy, to ask them how the pro bono fits in.
Okay,
Kevin is right. I would also double check in the policy if it's the firm doing it or if it's a member of the firm, and are they doing it on behalf of the firm, because then they may no longer be insured by their policy if they're not doing the work on behalf of the firm. So I would just call your insurance broker and have them check into it to see how you can best get it done.
Right, and you should do that before you engage in the pro bono work, by the way, not when you're in the middle of it or after you've done it and you've been sued. So it's
Kind of
just,
like signing a contract before you do the work, Michael.
yeah, that's except, obviously that happens about half the time if we're lucky. Right, so, the long and the short of it with pro bono is who's doing the work? Is it the firm, or is it the individual and the firm's not involved? What does the contract say? Is there insurance that will respond to it if it's through the firm? Make sure, make sure, as Kevin said, that the policy is written so that the pro bono work is in fact covered. Because the last thing you need is to be doing pro bono work and you don't realize that because of the way your insurance policy is now written, you're not covered. That would be horrific. All righty, so.
And Michael, really quick, if I can jump in, this is with pandemic or no pandemic. These are risk management processes. It's really more personal risk management. Make sure that you're going to be covered someplace, whether with your firm or maybe with your homeowner's policy, maybe. So double check with your broker on all these issues.
Yeah, but I can tell you, you don't want to be counting on your homeowner's policy. It might cover you, but boy, that's like the last place you want to look. All right, so in terms of where we are, according to my fancy Timex watch, it's 3:15. So we've gone for an hour and 15 minutes. I'd like to devote the final 15 minutes to questions. So if we have questions, and then the word is volunteer. I guess this is presumably the last CE word. But if we have questions from the people who are, listening to this thing, now would be the time, I guess. I don't know how, I'll be quite honest with you. I don't know how we get the questions. So I guess the people who are administering this.
Michael, I can read them to you.
Sure, that would be great. Well, read them to the panel. That'd be great.
Great, yeah, no problem. So let me start off. Richard says, I'm most concerned about getting back to job sites with myself and my staff. Who is responsible for site safety? Contractor, but also what do I need to protect myself? We can't get protective equipment.
Okay, so I guess let's answer the first one. The second one is medical advice, and you really have to consult with a doctor on that. You know, sorry, we don't have a doctor on the panel. You know, but in terms of who's in charge of a site, if you're an architect and you're visiting the site, you know.
Yes, that goes back to site safety, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so architects are not responsible for job site safety ever, right? Unless you take on that responsibility. So even though it might seem like it's a little bit of a gray area, you still do not have that responsibility. So the contractor or the site super is always responsible for job site safety. Sometimes you'll see in your contracts that you're required to comply with the safety guidelines provided by the owner, maybe. So you want to understand what's in your contract related to that. And if that's the case, then they should have, or you maybe you can require or ask them to ensure that they update their safety protocols to include any guidelines due to COVID-19. And then, of course, you're only responsible for your own people, which goes back to the very beginning of the meeting, talking about employee safety.
Right. I think Dina had given a pretty good list of things you might want to look at to begin with, which is the New York State COVID website, the CDC website, any industry specific things, like we just got this thing from New York State on reopening New York for construction. That's really geared towards contractors. OSHA rules, but there are probably a lot of other things. You know, so each firm has to, it's unfortunate, but each firm has to figure out what's the, you know, what's going to be their, you know, sort of universe of things they're going to look to be guided. I would recommend, because it's what I'm going to do with my firm, is I'm going to also consult with a couple of doctors and say, hey guys, what do I need to do, you know, sort of above and beyond, you know.
Michael?
Yeah, yeah.
So I saw a question pop up. If I could go ahead and address it, there was a question about what if you observe an unsafe situation related to COVID-19. So again, I would suggest that you still, you know, refer back to your already good basic standard protocols, right? So you see an unsafe situation, like a trench is not properly shored up, or someone's not harnessed up from, you know, hanging from a height or whatever, you would document and communicate, right? And depending on the imminence of danger, that happens pretty quickly. But as a observer of what's going on the job site, you're not responsible for it. So you want to document it and notify the proper person, which would be the site super or the contractor. But that's really the extent of your job, unless you're a safety code person. But generally speaking, an architect, you don't have that responsibility. So, but if you observe an unsafe situation, document and communicate.
You're not responsible for site safety on a grand scale, but if you see something that is unsafe, you better report it in writing, because you can be held liable for not doing so. And when you report it in writing, you can make it clear in your correspondence that, you know, while I am not responsible for site safety,
Right.
I noticed this, and you know, you should take appropriate remedy.
Right, and I think, as Mary Beth touched on, if it's an emergent situation, I would notify first, then write it up second. You know, I mean, if but use common sense, right? I mean, if it's something that's really, imminent threat to somebody's life potentially, you deal with that. You have a professional obligation to deal with, regardless of what your contract says. But in general, I agree completely with Mary Beth and with Tony. Site safety is simply not the responsibility of the architect, and especially when you're on site periodically, typically, right? Next question.
Sure. Nicholas asks, everyone is concerned about if an employee contracts the virus, what will the liability associated with that be? However, how is it going to be proved that the employee contracted the virus while working and not at the grocery store, et cetera?
Right.
That's the big question, right? And probably it's not. And what we're seeing, I don't think New York has this legislation yet, but I'll leave this to the others on the panel and see what they've heard. A lot of states are coming up with rebuttable presumption legislation for the workers' comp industry, at least in the essential worker space, but some are more broad than that. I'm saying that if you get COVID at work, there's a rebuttable presumption that it was work, or if you come down with COVID and you believe it's work related, there's some sort of rebuttable presumption. And every state is coming up with different ways to come at that. But the interesting thing is, I was discussing this today, what does that rebuttable presumption mean, right? And how would we as attorneys attack it? But at the end of the day, I mean, any individual who comes, unless there's an outbreak, right? I mean, we've heard about the meatpacking outbreaks and things like that, where so many individuals in that space have gotten it. If an individual comes down with COVID in the workspace, I mean, what would we do? We would look at all the places that they've been in the last, 2 weeks. Every time they went to the grocery store, every time they got gas, every time they got a delivery, every other individual in their house, right? And so I agree. I think the liability perspective on that would be and causation would be very, very difficult. And then of course there's, the federal government is trying to put backstops in for liability as well. So there's a lot of development and trending going on both at the state level and the federal level on this. And I think we have to wait and see what's going to happen. But the only thing we can do right now as an industry is do as much as we can from our own preparedness, follow the guidelines, so that if there's ever a case, we can say we did everything we were required to do.
If I can jump in, I'm going to jump in and add to Dina. I agree. From an insurance standpoint, if there's a situation where you think the person may or may have not gotten COVID in your office, send in a workers' comp claim. Don't hesitate. Don't wait for some legislation to come down the road. If it does at all, send it to the carrier. Have them start defending you.
Right. Next question.
Susan asks, regarding establishing parameters for office design that also applies to our own offices, not just to offices we might design for others, what would be the criteria for any redesign of our own offices apart from the information on New York State website, OSHA, CDC, et cetera?
Well, I guess the question is it going to be the architects who are going to answer the medical question, or the medical professions who are going to give out the criteria that the architects implement? You wouldn't want, what's his name, the infectious disease doctor we keep seeing on TV all the time. You wouldn't want that guy, as brilliant as he may be, designing a building, right? By the same token, I don't want my architect trying to figure out the proper way to deal with COVID-19. So I think the answer is, how do you figure it out? Well, if you get an assignment to design something that you then have to make sure that the owner, whether it's a single family house or a 50-story building, the owner has to retain people to give you the criteria that you need to be responsive to I think you then have to act reasonably, which is you need to be aware of whatever publications are sort of generally out there and make sure the criteria you're given is consistent. So for instance, today, you know that people are supposed to be 6 feet apart. Well, if your client says, I want you to design something so everybody's 2 feet apart because I really want to maximize the space, that puts you in a really funny position. Because if you do that, I'd love to be the plaintiff's lawyer who sues you, right? And I'm hoping you have a big insurance policy. So you have to act reasonably, but you can't presume expertise that you don't have. So the answer is you can't determine that, right? It's just like you can't design, if you're an architect, you're not designing the structure on a tall building and you're not designing the mechanical system. You need to rely on the expertise of certain other dedicated professionals. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Good answer.
Okay, next question.
We got a question in from Lewis saying, regarding professional liability insurance, my insurer is raising my rates by 30%, even though I would be happy to have 50% of the fees generated last year. Is there a way to get the insurers to understand how severely our fees will be affected by this year?
Well, I would change carriers, but that's just me.
Right. It's, I
brokers,
would basically have your broker take a look, you know, at other alternatives. You know, right now, the insurance marketplace is, even prior to the COVID situation, was seeing some tightening in certain specialty lines, builders risks, heavy trucking. It was basically a change that was, you know, the market was stiffening. It was, you know, firming up a little, so there were increases coming. This does not, you know, the COVID situation does not help matters. So it's one of, you know, talking with your broker, having them talk to the underwriters, and talk to some new underwriters. One challenge you have to be careful of, and now is not really the time to be changing carriers, is that the policies have warranties as to things you know that may have might result in a claim. And if you do not put that forth in your new application, it gives the carrier right of denial.
Yeah, which I guess raises one interesting point that I think everybody should be aware of. So if your insurance, and we'll leave you with this thought, if your insurance policy basically says if you change carriers, and really even if you don't, if you're aware of generally facts or circumstances that could, and I don't even know if the term reasonable, I'll leave it up to the broker, to reasonably lead to a claim exists, you're typically supposed to put your carrier on notice. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a claim per se, but at least they can start to work with you to try to, the theory is to try to mitigate in some way, shape, or form. So we've now gone through this horrific experience. Is it reasonable that on many of your projects there could be delays related to COVID-19? Is it reasonable that someone's going to bring a delay claim? And is it reasonable to assume that you might get named? And if all of that is true, the question to the brokers are, what do the architects do? Do they need to put their carriers on notice?
I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think we're getting back to what Mary Beth was talking about, communicating. I think the architects need to go out to communicate with all their owners and see what's going on. And if they feel there's going to be something coming down, they should send it into the insurance carrier as a pre-claim. That's what it's called, which is not unusual. If they think there's going to be something hitting them down the road, they should send it in for record purposes only as a pre-claim with a certain project.
And
Yeah, Peter is right.
oh,
And also, I'm sorry,
ahead.
Mary Beth, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, you know, sometimes when I talk to folks about things like that, they say, oh, no, I can't do that because it'll raise my rates, you know, if I file a claim or even if it's for record purposes only. So generally speaking, that it's not like your auto or homeowner's insurance where you got to worry about that. You want to notify your professional liability carrier because you don't want to risk not having coverage if the matter does pan out to something else. So it's okay to notify your PL carrier.
I would say just have a discussion with your broker, who will then have a discussion with the underwriter. Some carriers will not treat those as circumstances that could lead to a claim just because of COVID-19 and a delay. So have the conversation with the broker. They'll have a conversation with the underwriter, and they will help you out.
Yeah.
Right. I think Mary Beth raises an excellent point, which is just because you report the circumstance doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an increase in your insurance premium. Would the brokers agree or disagree with that?
Correct.
I agree.
Okay. All right, guys. So we've, of course, run over by a few minutes. Actually, according to my iPad, 1 minute. I'd like to thank the panel. You guys were fantastic. Wonderful group of people. All of you, you did great. Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Kevin. And especially, well, I shouldn't say especially because you've all been wonderful. Thank you, Dina. Who knows? Maybe we'll do this again sometime.
All right. Be safe, everyone.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Be safe.